Lynn and I are delighted to be joined today by Professor Linda Price, who's Professor of Marketing at University of Wyoming. Linda's work and leadership has and continues to be highly influential in the field of consumer research, with many of her papers now considered seminal in the field, while Linda has served on many prestigious editorial, presidential and fellowship roles. Her more recent work on repair, sustainability and in particular dirt will be the focus of today's conversation. We could fill our podcast with all the reasons that we're delighted to welcome Linda here today, but we're really keen to get started. So welcome, Linda. It's great to have you here. And I'd really like to start our conversation today by asking you where you feel consumer behaviour research has got to in terms of sustainability and the circular economy.
So first of all, I want to thank both you and Lynn for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor and privilege to participate, and I'm really excited to hear about Lynn's research, which I think is really taking on a lot of important problems in the field. When we look at the history of, for example, the Journal of Consumer Research, which I was recently editor of, it's going on 50 years now. And from the very beginning of its history, it's made calls for work on how consumers dispose of stuff. And there's still virtually no work in that journal on that topic. So I think it's a topic that's really ripe for a lot of rethinking on the part of all consumer behavior researchers and the field of marketing more generally. And so while I think that there's a heartfelt concern that we move toward a circular economy, I think that in tackling that, we've taken such a piecemeal approach that we really are not doing everything we can to get a handle on it. And, that's one of the reasons why I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what Lynn's doing, because I know she's really trying to tackle it from a lot of different angles. But I think that just to give a real simple example, we maybe have started to think about how we can not have all of our food waste go into waste, and we can make sure that we interrupt or intervene to change that. But in the scheme of things, we haven't looked at how we might affect how you make a decision to purchase food in the beginning and how you store and retain food over a period of time so that it gets used up in your kitchen before it hits the pile of waste. And so I think that we need to take a full, from production to purchase to consumption to how you work with repair, which is one of the things that I've been looking at recently, to then how we think about actually what we dispose of and what we continue to use, despite these very frightening boundaries around dirt and contamination. So I think it's a really rich field for a lot of endeavors. And I hope that the next 10 years of the Journal of Consumer Research are markedly different in their attention to some of these issues than the past 50 years have been. So maybe I'll stop there, Deirdre, unless you have some follow-up questions, and we can get into a more one-on-one discussion.
I think, Linda, that was a perfect segue into asking Lynn to talk about more now, or introduce us to the topic today that we wanted to focus in on around dirt. And it would be great, Lynn, if you could tell us a bit about how you came to contamination as a theory for your research.
Thank you, Deirdre, and Linda. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for being here and giving me the opportunity to really explain why I chose contamination theory. And I think it's because coming from a background prior to the PhD in strategy and government related waste management and resource management, circular economy strategy, in all of it, it talks about contamination as a key threat to circularity. And what I realized is that they mean that from an industrial point of view. So the contamination of a recycling system or the contamination of a reuse system. You mentioned food earlier on, Linda, and I suppose the most simplistic example is the idea of how clean is your plastics packaging recycling. You know, if it's completely saturated in food, then it's really difficult it then contaminates the whole of the recycled packaging. And so I was thinking about that in relation to clothing. In a post-consumer clothing disposal system, when the consumer is finished with their clothing and they're disposing of it, how does that decision-making process mean that 92 million tons of clothing ends up in landfill globally, which is a contaminant to the landfill, but along the way, somewhere at some point, that clothing has been rejected because it's not suitable for function. And so what I really wanted to understand is, what do we mean by contamination? And when I looked at the literature from a consumer behaviour perspective, it talks a lot in terms of clothing. It talks a lot about hygiene and hygiene issues and stigma, but it really doesn't unpack what we mean by that and how that then transfers to a system of reuse or a system of post-consumer circulation of material. And so when I was looking at the literature, I did begin to think that there was quite a gap between, Rosen's work in consumer response to dirt and pollution and ideas of rejection. But all of that work is theoretical. It's very testing a concept rather than actually engaging with consumers in the habitus. And that's what I really wanted to understand. I wanted to understand what was going on in the family home or the individual home. What was that use process and then that disposal process, that rejection or passing on process that meant something. A decision is made at that micro individual level, or in my research at the meso level, at the community level, that ends up contaminating this macro industrial system of circulation. So looking at those three lenses, it was trying to understand, how does an industrial macro system get contaminated by individual actions and decision making in clothing? And from there, it was about, looking at other theories, who was looking at this issue. And I found that industrial theorists from Imperial College were looking at it, but from a design perspective. So again, they were very interested in what's happening from a systems perspective to improve the system. And whilst they were very interested in consumer behaviour, again, not taking an entirely deep dive into what consumers are doing. And so whilst I learned a lot from that, I really wanted to find another way of looking at the challenge. And so I then looked at Rachman's theory of contamination theory, which comes from obsessive compulsive disorder. And whilst I'm not looking at the clinical behaviour of consumers, I took his model of the idea of disgust and fear. Consumer disgust and fear really started to address this idea of hygiene. So from there, looking at Mary Douglas and Douglas's theory of purity and dirt, it was really sort of beginning to see this is really about the core beliefs and experiences, consumer behaviour experiences, that we begin to understand what is acceptable and not acceptable in society that is then pushed on through a circulation or a recycling system in relation to products like clothing.
And I have to say, Lynn, that I feel like a lot of our consumer behavior research has been taking stimuli to consumers and then looking for responses of disgust and fear. So sort of the consequences of feelings of contamination. And I think that sort of connecting that to Mary Douglas's work, where we really think about what is dirt and how do we socially construct dirt, and how is dirt embodied in our own environments. That's really an important connection that I think we do need to do a better job of making in our work on dirt. Because I mean, Mary Douglas would really say dirt is whatever feels like it's out of place. And that we socially construct that, right? And that means that we can intervene to change that as well. And I think a lot of what you're trying to understand is that embodied experience at the meso level of dirt, so that we can begin to understand what our intervention opportunities are for changing those socially constructed boundaries. So I think that's really commendable, Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And in relation to that idea of matter out of place, the challenge we have when it comes to something like clothing, we see where a garment might be stained. So yes, you would say potentially that is an indication that there was matter out of place at some point on a garment. But then what we have to use our other senses to look at or to experience is that garment actually dirty, or has it been laundered? And then we get into the nuances of the challenge of when we're thinking about the subjectivity of each of us thinking about matter out of place, or thinking about that relationship between the proximity of how we feel about dirt, or how we experience dirt, or how we get uncomfortable about something, how we, each of us, potentially we definitely don't think about dirt in the same way. It doesn't symbolize the same thing to all of us. And that is the key to the challenge, because we're trying to create these macro global systems of circularity. But if we have this individualistic challenge of we all have a different approach to what's dirty and what's not, then we have this real problem when we're trying to create systems.
Right. And I think one of the things that you hinted at in your work, and that's also really apparent in a lot of this problem of getting from one person's dirt to another person's dirt, is in fact this idea that on the one hand, we do try to manage our dirt, but we often feel like even though what we have is not useful for us anymore, someone else can use it. And so we're always pushing our dirt off on someone else. And in fact, I think that's a key ethos of consumption, is that we clean our dirt and we push dirt we can't clean off onto someone else, and expect them to either clean it or use it. And so we have a whole culture with that sort of ethos of consumption that problematizes the way in which all of us are dealing with dirt.
And I think, Lynn, that came through in your research, didn't it, really, with that that differences in terms of how people experience dirt, or what they experience as dirt, but also where does it actually go when you don't want that anymore?
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things, because I was focused on this contamination and thinking about what is a contaminant. And again, that comes back to that individuality of consumers deciding for them what feels uncomfortable to them. And it comes back to discomfort. A lot of it was about discomfort. And so, for example, what I saw was consumers who could describe really well how they didn't want a garment anymore, but they were going to pass it on to a charity. But when they described that garment, they were actually describing how it gave them discomfort. Say maybe if there was a ragged seam, and they would say, well, it just made me feel uncomfortable, but I'm going to pass it on to the charity. I'm going to pass it on to my local charity because I think someone else could use it. And I thought that was really interesting, that idea of a sort of real contaminant, a real threat to a consumer. But whilst they were pushing away the threat, they were disposing of the threat, they felt that, but it's only a threat to me, it's not a threat to someone else. And that's a really interesting example of how that micro garment then gets into the system and subjectively gets evaluated, because the next evaluation point, for example, if it's a charity retail model, the next evaluation point will be another individual. And that individual is only looking potentially at the garment in a way that they've been trained in terms of sorting it. But they perhaps can't see that ragged seam, which might be in the inside. So then that means that it gets sorted to be resold. And then someone buys it, and then they still have this issue with the ragged seam that wasn't prevalent until they got it home. So then this garment potentially gets rejected again. And where does it go? Does it become part of that 40% of garments that are hoarded in the wardrobe? Or does it get passed on again? So we're continuously passing on this garment that is harmful through the system. And so this is, I suppose, what I mean by a contaminant, which is less obvious than, say, a sweat-stained T-shirt, where the challenge is that with the sweat stains, we can all see them. But again, that T-shirt might have been laundered. So it's actually a fresh laundered T-shirt, but these stains are more akin to where Douglas or previous scholars were thinking about in terms of that that matter out of place, or the fluids, bodily fluids that society is challenged by, in terms of the confusion around a stain that may that automatically symbolizes danger. So if we look at purity and danger, it's these symbols of danger that we've been taught to respond to protect us, which goes in turn back to hygiene.
Yeah, but I really, really like, one of the things I really, really like about what you're talking about, Lynn, is that you're really trying to think about these nuances of that tipping point where we go, I'm going to get rid of this garment because it's not for me anymore. And then the nuances of how that's going to get interpreted on the other end, in terms of the extent to which they detect the same matters out of place that the original owner did when they decided to dispose of it. And, I've been doing some work on repair as well, which, also we're working on a project kind of on the ethos of repair, and how that's really misaligned with our ethos of consumption. So we kind of wonder why that person didn't go, this is kind of uncomfortable. Can I fix it? Can I make it better? Can I correct the problem so that it's no longer uncomfortable for me and I can keep it? But instead they go, this is uncomfortable. I get rid of it and replace it with something that I hope is going to be more comfortable. So I think you're really getting at some rich and important issues in terms of both what makes us decide to just get rid of it. And then, of course, how we get rid of it. And you have some nice nuanced data on that as well. But also these nuances of how it gets interpreted on the other side in terms of its usefulness or lack of usefulness because of a perceived contamination or lack thereof. And so I think it's a really complex issue. And at that intersection is really, really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you bring up repair, because in my data, in my small sample of the 30 households, everyone had some story to tell about repair of a garment, about trying to extend the longevity of that garment, and also frustration that some garments, particularly maybe high value ones like a waterproof jacket that they'd potentially had for 15, 20 years, that they had repaired, they had re-waterproofed it, they had repaired the seams that had burst, but then it had got to that point where they just felt the garment was saturated in repair. And it had reached, as you say, Linda, that tipping point where they felt this is just no good to me anymore. And a garment like that in a home where they're already repairing, many of them were cutting up their garments that could no longer be worn for repair patches in the home, for things. But even then, they'd got to a saturation point where they thought, well, I've got enough of this. So where do I go? And they felt, I've got nowhere to go with this. It needs to go in the bin. And that's a really, I know that you and I were talking a while back about Patagonia and Patagonia's repair model. Could you say more about what you found with that model?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not sure that your consumers who are doing that should feel bad at the end, because when I think of that word, even saturated with repair, what a cool notion. What if we could do that more often? What if consumers more frequently saturated their goods with repair? Then I think we would feel a lot better about them going into the bin. And I think we would have a lot less waste. So I want to say kudos to those of your informants who saturated their objects with repair, because I think that's highly commendable. I do think that one of the problems that we've talked about and other people have talked about is the idea of once it goes out of a system where there's knowledge about repair and there's knowledge about construction and production of the object, it makes it more difficult for it to have a useful afterlife. So, for example, if I throw away a garment that then arrives at charity, so I'm trying to recycle it, it goes to charity, but they don't know how to interpret its production or its value or its possibility for continued utility. It's much more likely to fall into complete non-use. But if we can control that process a bit, then maybe we can hold more things in that repair cycle such that we can contribute to saturated repair, which I'm really loving that term. I'm really liking it a lot. So Patagonia, I think their effort is to get you to buy a really good jacket that they know how it was produced. They know everything that went into it, and they can repair it until it dies, until there's no life left. And they can do that for you. I think that some other companies have tried to adopt that kind of model of keeping it in-house, but without as much of that repair mentality behind it, more of a sort of recycle, we hope, mentality. But I do think there's some promise there, just because so many things we throw away or we try to recycle, we're hopeful about. We believe that they could be repaired, or they could be cleaned, or they could be revamped, or they could be useful to someone. And yet we know that, in fact, as you said, Lynn, they're not. And they just end up in great big heaps of trash that we can do nothing with.
And I think this is one of the areas where your research really has overlaps both Linda and Lynn's research in the sense of that scalar level. So in the repair work, Linda, that kind of disconnect between the producers of the shoes and those who have to repair the shoes. And Lynn, for you, your informants, trying to find the best means of disposal to keep an item in movement for long enough. So it'd be nice to hear a bit more about what you feel about those scalar disconnects, I guess, that create that infrastructure that makes it the barriers and challenges for consumers in this space alongside other actors.
Uh, I think Deirdre could probably go on for a long time on this, and so could Lynn, and so could I. So I think, I think we've just scratched the surface here. So I think many, many challenges remain. And as you said, I think one of the biggest challenges is sort of aligning the different parts of the system in terms of how we think about that circular economy, and not just focusing on one point in that circular economy, but trying to think about how that one point is informed at production, at sourcing, at choice of buying, at purchase, at consumption, at repair, and then at disposal. And so I think, that's one of the challenges. But I've been doing this really weird project on dirt and dirt work, and people who really have a different sense of dirt, who embrace dirt and are really proud of their ability to take what other people see as dirty and use it, create bounty from it, create value from it. And I think some of Karen Fernandez's work on dumpster divers has also sort of revealed this idea that someone else's trash can be someone else's treasure. And so these treasure hunters who are going after yours and my trash, in some sense also do something really important. They force us to rethink what we mean by dirt, to rethink whether, for example, we should be cleaning our house as often as we do, whether maybe, in fact, we should be embracing dirt a little bit more. And for example, even the amount of effort and resources that we pour into cleaning have a downstream consequence from a sustainability perspective. A lot of the cleaning that we're doing is actually destroying our environment. And so it's fun to sort of focus on a group of people who love dirt and who define their lives in terms of grasping utility from other people's dirt. And I know that for me, I'm kind of a compulsive, obsessive cleaner. And so it's actually forced me to sort of rethink my own dirt, to really think about contamination as something where I need to rethink my social construction of that in ways that maybe would provide a nudge in terms of sustainability. But there are big issues to take on. So I'm going to turn it over to Lynn and let her take on some of those big issues.
I think that's really fascinating, Linda. And I'm so glad you brought it up in that frame, because a key part of my research was that findings was that the UK is experiencing a moth pandemic at the moment. So moths get into the wardrobe, get into the home, and as long as they have debris, as long as they have dust, as long as they have keratin from our hair, from our skin, from the amount of millions of skin cells that we shed every day, then that's what they're happy to live on. And so what we see is that we spend up to 90% of our time indoors. And during the pandemic period, when I did my research, we were indoors for up to 100%. But we are, in general, cleaning less. And so this debris is building up and creating environments for mites. And so what it really highlights is the absolute confusion of consumer messaging and awareness of what we need to do and what we don't need to do. We absolutely need to really address the amount of chemicals we use in the home and how that has that macro impact on the planet. But what we potentially could address is, are we cleaning out enough? Are we shaking our clothes out enough? Are we shaking our house out enough? Are we doing the things we used to do? Simple brushing out the debris of the house. Those really simple tasks. I think there is that sort of global macro challenge of we've become so reliant on chemicals to eradicate us, to keep us clean, to keep us healthy, to protected from those so-called dirt or contaminants in our life. And this is the sort of the challenge we have to really examine, and the one that I want to keep examining is this misalignment between misunderstanding of what we need to do to save the planet and what we can do every day. And so that idea of embracing a little bit of dirt is actually absolutely in terms of sort of Walter Stahl's work and saying children need to be really exposed to, we need to share children's clothing more because they need to be exposed to bacteria. And by doing it through the sharing of clothing, then that builds up the resistance. So there we have this contradiction again of sort of healthy dirt or healthy bacteria through the sharing and through circulation, whereas the opposite being in how we need to manage our household behaviours through cleaning in order to ensure we don't have these infestations in the home of mites, whether it's dust mites that bite us or moths that the larva infests into our knitwear, into our keratin-based garments, and then eats through them and eats through our carpets and our interior furnishings. We really need to get our messaging right. We need to understand how we can support the consumer in this journey.
I think that's a really good point. And in some ways, maybe it comes back to that ethos of consumption I talked about. Because one of the things that Matt Godfrey and I talk about in our Journal of Consumer Research repair paper is the idea that in order to maintain and repair, I have to take time out from consumption. And I have to dedicate myself to maintaining the object and repairing the object. And both of those actually may interrupt my consumption in various ways. And so I think that even when you're thinking about house cleaning, we're looking for a simple purchase fix, right? Purchase some chemicals and make it go away. And what you're saying is that in fact, maintenance and repair of our objects requires a more considered approach where we're really focusing on, and Matt and I in our recent work are kind of drawing on the notion of an object-focused care, where we're really taking care of the object. And our focused attention is on that care of the object. So I do think that, a lot of what you say are so complex, such complex problems that dirt we love and dirt we don't. And of course, figuring out what that difference is. But I do think that one consistent part of that is our tendency to fall back on consumption as the answer, purchase and consumption, rather than the other behaviors that make up sustainable practices in a home or in a community.
And I think that's why research really embedded in the home is so important, like understanding all of these behaviours in context.
Yeah, and I mean, I was overwhelmed by how much consumers are trying to do and how much skill they have, but also how much questioning they have, how much questioning about are they doing the right thing? They are doing really well, but is it still the right thing? And even things like the balance of maintaining the home and trying to do the right thing. So for example, participants who had baby wear that had perhaps got saturated with pathogens because the baby was unwell or the child was unwell, and they were evaluating very quickly in terms of trying to manage the home and saying, oh my goodness, but I need to clean this but then getting to the point of saying, actually, the more I try to clean this item, the more I'm endangering the family by spreading bacteria. So I just need to dump this in the bin, and I need to be okay with that because I need to protect my family. And that's really sort of interesting, this idea of balancing dirt and balancing bacteria every day, but also this almost cognitive dissonance of, I know this is the wrong thing to do. I know it's the wrong thing to put it in the bin, but I need to protect my family. And so you then begin to think, gosh, yeah, you automatically you're thinking, well, that sounds like you did the right thing. It sounds like you did your best and you did the right thing and it was the only solution. But that's very different from someone who maybe wore a garment once close to the skin and they felt uncomfortable. It just gave them a psychologically uncomfortable, contaminated feeling that then it was discarded in the bin. And I didn't come across those stories with my informants of rejecting something in that way, but there's all sorts of multiple reasons we know that consumers don't tell us the whole story, or perhaps that story wasn't there to tell. I mean, certainly some of the participants did intimate about some of their partners who seemed to be particularly quick to recycle it, to cycle the wear of a garment and then put it in the bin. But I didn't receive that data from them. So that was a really interesting interesting anecdotes about how one sort of person was trying to manage the family home and trying to influence behavior of the other partner.
I think you make a really good point, and it takes me back to a project I did a long time ago that I never really published anything out of it. But I collected a lot of data on it. And I collected a lot of data on people trying to use stuff up. And I do think, in fact, and it seems like it shows up in your data too, is that, and we found this kind of across social classes and across economic conditions, that people would hang on to stuff until it was completely used up. So you'd go into their shower and you'd see 3 shampoo bottles, and 2 of them had so little in them that you couldn't imagine how they were going to actually ever get that out. But they were committed to using it up to the very last drop. And you see the same thing in their refrigerators. So I think we do underestimate sometimes consumers' desire to extract as much utility out of their objects as they can. And what I'm hearing from you, Lynn, is resoundingly that many of your informants were trying to really extract as much utility from their objects as they could. Now, we know that we have a lot of waste that doesn't coincide with that. But I think that sometimes we're accidental wasters. So, for example, we go to a restaurant, they give us too much food, and this is less likely to happen in the UK than it is maybe in the US. But in the US, it's very common that you order and get too much food. And then you're trying to decide what to do with it. And of course, you want to use up all of that utility. So you take it home with you. But then it sits in the refrigerator and it doesn't get used, and it goes into the trash can, a couple days later. And maybe if there'd have been an intervention earlier on, where we went, no, don't bring that food to me. That's too much. Or we had a way of taking part of it away and partitioning it so that it could get put into a different cycle of redemption in terms of its utility. But I do think, that it's not that consumers want to waste. It's that combination of not knowing how my waste relates to other people's waste and not knowing the boundaries, and frequently having people, and you talked about this, who violate that boundary and then create waste out of what I was careful to recycle. You were talking about that plastic that has so much food in it that you can't rescue it. So I think we want to be generous to consumers in some sense, in saying their heart is often in the right place. And yet they're not able, and they struggle with these decisions. Lynn, when you're talking about your data, I hear that they're struggling with their decisions. They want to do the right thing to rescue that utility from that product. So we want to give them credit, and then we want to give them help so that they can do that well.
I mean, one of the key aspects is getting people to think less of waste and the waste being a resource. I mean, that's a key issue, I guess, across the context of clothing particularly. But then, Lynn, what you were highlighting was some of the nuances of that. If a garment's infected with moths, for example, then is it a resource or is it actually waste? So that, again, it comes back to, I guess, those boundaries of dirt, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to the moths, I mean, what we see is that, and I've had this experience myself, where you go and you buy a garment in a charity shop and you don't notice that it has little moth holes in it, where there's larvae. You take it home, it perhaps looks clean. It maybe had the label on it. So you think, okay, I don't need to launder that. I'll just store that away. And, then store it away to the back of the cupboard. And then the next spring, your spring cleaning, not only is that jumper unwearable now, but the moth larva has eaten through the whole wardrobe. Then you start doing your spring clean, you pull out your sofa to find that there's a whole eaten up area from the moths under that sofa. So you end up having to eradicate your carpets, your furnishings, just by this one little purchase in the in my case, it was in a charity shop. And then it just, contaminates the whole home.
That probably raises another avenue for research, which is sort of the anticipation of contamination. And how consumers think about and anticipate where they will pick up dirt that they are then going to have their life affected by. And I know that, the extreme case was COVID, where we sort of lived in fear of the contamination that might come our way. But I think you give another really interesting example of how that sort of anticipation of contamination affects a lot of our choices as well, potentially. And I don't know about research on that particularly.
I think that would be a really nice point to actually talk a little bit about avenues for future research. Linda, where do you see the kind of key areas to move forward this topic of consumer and dirt?
Well, I do think that one of the things that Lynn's doing is really key, which is to link parts of the distribution chain together. Because I feel like we're not going to get at the problem unless we can understand it. And I'm a person who studies family. So I'm inclined to think that an awful lot of decisions that are made that may appear to be at the individual level are actually collective decisions, and they're intended to serve the collective identity of the household. And so I really think it's really important to think about not just an individual choice in an individual situation where there's a threat of contamination, but actually how dirt is managed in the household in accordance with the norms that may even vary across family members. And I think Lynn talked about this, that what the wife sees maybe as dirty, the husband may see as almost sacred, a fruit of my labor. And so I think it's interesting to think about this in more complexity than we have so far. And I think that's where the rich research is going to come from. It's from thinking about how the family together manages dirt, how the community together manages dirt, and especially how we align at those intersections between users or between users and the next filter of that dirt. And also how we can improve knowledge across those frontiers. So how we can help the people who are doing repair understand the consumer, help the consumer understand the repair process, help the consumer understand how the purchase of an object affects its repairability, and also help consumers understand when you can put something in the bin and feel just fine about it, and when that's what you should do instead of something else. Do not recycle the pizza box. And yet consumers believe, oh, this is a nice box. It doesn't look that greasy. It can be recycled, right? So I think all of those areas of intersection between agents, actors in that system of sustainability is going to be really important. And I think Lynn has taken some initial really important steps in that direction, at least from what I can tell.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think across the scale, different actors, if we want a circular system, then we need everybody in that circular system to be operating in tandem, not in silos, if it is going to be truly a clean and closed loop.
Yeah, and I think for me, what I really set out to do was put the consumer at the centre of the circle, not to almost that everything should radiate out. And I really liked the idea of the collective identity of whether it's the family or the community. Through that, putting that identity at the centre, and then by doing so, really forcing all of the other actors to really look at what does that collective identity or individual need? What are the needs of a product like clothing? We seem to, in the product world, become so disconnected from actually what a consumer needs or what the unit needs in order to perform throughout a 24-hour life cycle. And I think when we look at that 24-hour life cycle compared to the life cycle of a product, we then start to really unpack the use and the misuse and the opportunity to extend the life of that product. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done, just thinking about the future, Deirdre, a lot of work to be done in really understanding that collective identity, as you say, Linda, that for me, we haven't really, within a circular economy framework, unpacked who are we doing this for. In strategy and policy, it seems to have still be repeating the mistakes of the past, trying to create a circular system, but learning from a linear system, which puts the consumer at the end. So by repositioning the consumer in the centre, then we really start to be able to understand that collective identity.
We've talked a lot about that consumer at the center because all three of us are really consumer researchers. But I have had an opportunity to do a project on how really big, mostly consumer goods kinds of companies think about sustainability. And I'll tell you that, and I'm sure you've probably heard this as well, Lynn, it's not just consumers who are really confused about what it means to be sustainable, but companies are really confused too. They're really confused about how to create that circular economy. And you hinted at that, at saying that, we really still think in this linear way. And it's very hard to adopt a systems way of thinking. And unless we adopt a systems way of thinking, we're not going to grab hold of real sustainability. And yet it's not just consumers that have trouble doing that. Companies have a lot of trouble too, trying to figure out how to build in systems thinking into the decisions they're making. So, even a triple bottom line is a very linear way of thinking. It's not a systems way of thinking. So I think it's going to take some time to get there, and it's going to take a lot of your research and hopefully our research to make those connections between consumers, purchase, use, consumption, and repair, disposal, and then what happens next, what its afterlife looks like for that object.
I think that's probably a perfect place to end the podcast. So I'd really like to thank Linda and Lynn for a really great conversation today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It was great fun. Great fun. Good luck.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Deirdre, for hosting today. Thank you. Thank you for listening and watching Cleaning the Loop, Driving Consumer Clothing Circularity, a podcast series produced by the Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow. If you would like to know more about my research or that of the scholars participating in the podcast series, please email me at lynn.wilson@glasgow.ac.uk. Thank you for listening and watching.